Hey, it's Drybear. And I've been going through all of the build possibilities for Necromancer in Diablo 4 as I work my way through every class in the game. I've already finished my bone builds and my bone exploration, my blood deep dive, and we just finished thorns as well. So the time has finally come for me to deep dive into minion builds for Necromancer. But just as before, we needed to arm ourselves with knowledge. So for the last few days, I have been doing nothing but spending time in the lab testing out minion procs, minion effects, minion stats, minion behavior, and how to make the most out of minions for necromancers. And so today I'd like to show you my findings, everything that I learned about how minions work, some things you may not know, and some things that may surprise you about the minion functionality in Diablo 4. But first, you should come hang out with me on my live stream. I'm live every single day on twitch.tv/Drybear. If you don't come hang out with me in the community, then the next time you're cooking bacon, when you take the bacon off of the heat source, you're going to realize the bacon is only about 95% of the crispiness that you wanted, and you're too lazy to put it back on because you've already cleaned up. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this into two separate videos. This video is just going to be about the findings. For people that don't care about the process, they just want to know, what are the answers? What did you learn? Give it to us straight. And then in a separate video, so this one doesn't get too long, I'm going to separate out as much footage as I could gather that is usable of all the testing that I did, what showed up, what the exact values were. And that way, if there's other things that people want to glean from that or make their own conclusions, they can. But at the very least, this video is going to focus on the findings. I have to start with disclaimers. All of this testing was done on the live client as an end user. I do not have any dev access or any of that stuff. And so all the testing here should be taken with an asterisk in that, you know, I'm just testing out certain things. I tried to be as precise and as scientific as I could, changing only single stat values. I spent a lot of gold respecking and buying gear off of vendors that was low quality, that only had a single stat on it. And I tried to keep everything else the same. For all of my tests, I wrote down my attack power, my sheet stats, and I tried to change only one possible thing, keeping track of everything else. And I tried, if there was something that seemed a little fishy, I tested it out in multiple situations against multiple types of enemies in many different types of encounters to try and see if I can get the same results over and over. And for most of the stuff, I was able to hone in on what I think is an exact answer. And then some of the things were not exact, and we'll talk about that as we go along. But just keep in mind, without, you know, being able to go to an engineer and saying, hey, what exactly are the modifiers for world tier difficulty? What kind of mobs are treated a certain way? Which of these mobs have high resistances or high armor, and why? All of that, we're just kind of testing. Also, for anything that was a percentage effects like critical strike damage, damage multipliers, or even lucky hit chance, I tried to test them in as large a sample size as I possibly could within reason, so that I wasn't just doing a handful of them and then making extended conclusions on that. So for things for like critical strike, I did each test sample of 1,000 hits. It took a while. It was like 10 minutes each time, but I wanted to be sure that, you know, if I had 5% critical strike, over 1,000 hits, was it about 5%? And I feel like that hopefully gets rid of the issue of too small of a sample size, making these harder. For damage hits, I did 300 hits. And then for attack speed modifiers, I used a speed run timer to track number of hits inside of either a 2-minute window or a 5-minute window to test out how the attack speed was working, and then calculated that into attacks per second. So let's dive into it. The first thing to look at is which minions do the highest DPS. And I know there's gonna be a lot of burning questions that people have about the minions themselves. This is for Necromancer. I haven't looked at the other classes that have minions, but in general, Skirmishers and Reapers do about the same DPS based on your sheet stats. However, Reapers can cleave multiple targets and have a special attack. So in general, Reapers tend to do better DPS than Skirmishers, and it shouldn't come as any surprise, but Defenders do the lowest of all the Warrior minion DPS because they are obviously the tankiest. Shadow Mages do slightly more DPS on average than Cold Mages. Kind of makes sense since Cold Mages can apply status effect and they can apply vulnerable. So you would think that they would have a little bit more DPS overall. And Bone Mages do significantly more DPS than the other two types of mages. And if they didn't, it would be weird because obviously they're sacrificing themselves to do it. Blood Golem actually does a serious amount of single target damage. I didn't think he actually did this much, but the Blood Golem does have higher attack speed and higher single target damage than the other two. However, the Bone Golem does the highest AoE because the Bone Golem does have a cleave attack, which is a pretty wide wedge. It's almost 180 degrees. It's massive. And so the Bone Golem does a little bit less than the Blood Golem, but does cleave in AoE. So in general, in normal situations, Bone Golem will probably do the highest DPS. But in single target, the Blood Golem does win out. Then Iron Golem is the lowest DPS, but keep in mind that has, depending on which modifier you choose, has a multi-hit attack and an ability to apply vulnerable. For critical strikes, this one took the longest to test because I wanted to do it over 1,000 hits, but all minions can critically strike by default. I tested every variation of the warriors, the mages, and the golems, and they all will be able to critically strike by default. So they will be able to apply that with their attacks. All minions gain about 30% of your bonus critical strike chance. This is the crit chance listed on your sheet stats, and this tracks with what we'd expect, right? There's a loading screen tip that says that minions gain 30% of all your stats, and in this case, it seems to line up perfectly. Whatever your critical strike chance is, all of your minions gain 30% of that value for themselves, and they also gain 30% of your bonus critical strike damage. I tested this a bunch, and it's right on the money, 30%. So whatever your critical strike damage, your bonus is listed on your sheet, they get 30% of that. The one thing that I learned that took a little while too is that minions have a floor of 50% crit strike damage, just like every player in the game. What this means is that if you have 0% bonus crit damage, your minions will still have a base of 50%. So even if you have none on your sheet, you're not providing any amount of crit damage to them. If they critically strike, it will do 50% more damage than their normal hit, even without any. And this is the same for players. Close and distant damage was a big question. This is one that I've been asking myself, at least since the beta. And I didn't really have an answer until I tested it, but this is what close and distant damage does for your minions. All minions have or seem to have a default of 0% close and distant damage, which means if you're not providing any, they don't have any. All minions gain 30% of your bonus close damage and your bonus distant damage. But the burning question for me was, is this calculated based on the position of the Necromancer or based on the position of the minion? And how does it calculate based on melee versus ranged? And I can tell you that minion and close and distant damage is calculated in real time when the attack is launched from the minion, which means that if mobs are moving or the minion is moving, it's when that attack launches. There's no snapshotting done when you summon the minion. None of that happens in real time, which is the way it should happen for that kind of calculation. Minion close and distant damage is based on the minion's proximity to the enemy, not to the Necromancer's. The Necromancer's positioning has no sway over close and distant damage for minions, which is kind of cool. It's something that it loses value in my mind because you can't really precisely control where your minions are standing and where they go. You can kind of guide them, and by how you move, you can make them move, but it's never going to be exact, which makes close and distant damage kind of a mixed bag of value. But you do know that golems and warriors should always be dealing damage at close because they're melee, and that mages should, in most cases, be doing distant. But of course, if a melee enemy runs up to a mage and starts hitting them and they fire back at the enemy, they're going to be in close range and not benefit from distant damage. The next thing to test was a big one in the Necromancer community right now, which is minions and lucky hit. And I tried to test out every possible thing that I could here in every possible scenario that I could think of, as well as some of the concepts that have been going around in the Necromancer community around what works and what doesn't work and all that. And this, after tons of testing, is what I found. Minions do not inherit any of your lucky hit procs. So if you have like Fists of Fury on or Fists of Fate on your gloves with 4 lucky hits, if you have chance to proc primary resource, if you have chance to proc heal, if you have lucky hit procs from your skills, from any of your stats, from any of your gear pieces, none of your proc effects are inherited by your minions. You can't give them your proc effects. However, there is one exception. Abhorrent Decrepify is a modifier for Decrepify that makes it so that any enemy that is affected by Decrepify, when that debuffed enemy receives damage, it triggers a lucky hit. This seems to be the only exception for minions and is the only lucky hit that they can actually trigger themselves. And I guess it's because my only conclusion for this is that it's your lucky hit effect, And what it's listening for while that debuff is active is, do I receive damage that the owner of that damage is the Necromancer? Okay, trigger the lucky hit. So from that being the only lucky hit that minions can trigger, these are the minion effects that can trigger that lucky hit, which tells me, at the very least, that those attacks are lucky hits from those minions. By default, no minion basic attacks trigger any lucky hit effects. If they're just auto-attacking, not a single minion of all of the minions can trigger lucky hit. However, the Reaper special attack, where they slam their scythe down, and the Defender shield slam, which is at the end of their basic hit attack chain, where they throw their shield forward, those two can trigger lucky hit effects like Abhorrent Decrepify. Also, on top of this, which is very encouraging, all minion thorns can trigger lucky hit effects, which means that if you're running Abhorrent Decrepify, which is the only lucky hit that I'm aware of that minions can trigger in the game right now, you want to run at least a non-zero amount of thorns so that they inherit that, because the thorn procs from enemies hitting minions can trigger Abhorrent Decrepify. I also tested, there was some discussions going around that the Coldbringer aspect for cold mages that spawns a blizzard triggers lucky hit. It actually doesn't. I had the cold mages hitting enemies for 10, 20 minutes. They didn't trigger it a single time. I tested on different enemies in different world tiers in different conditions. There wasn't a single instance of the blizzard or the cold mage basic attacks triggering lucky hit. However, if you were to give those mages thorns, the thorns that they would get from being attacked, that would trigger the lucky hit. So that's where we're at with lucky hit and minions. When it comes to elemental damage, this one was pretty much what you'd expect. Cold mages gain 30% of your bonus cold damage. Shadow mages gain 30% of your bonus shadow damage, and this is regardless of whether it's from your Paragon board or whether it's from your stats. They get 30% of it. The Coldbringer aspect for cold mages benefits from 30% of your cold damage. And by the way, the Coldbringer aspect stacks additively on the target. So if you have 6 mages that are all casting Coldbringer, it'll stack the Blizzard 6 times on one target, which is pretty cool. Also, mages seem to benefit from 30% of your physical damage, but for some reason, warriors don't, which seemed really weird to me. I feel like they are doing physical damage. They're in melee swinging a weapon. I would think that they would benefit from physical damage, but in all my testing, I didn't get a single warrior to do any more damage than he was doing before with any amount of physical damage that I had. So for some reason, mages benefit from physical damage, warriors do not. For skill damage, all minions do benefit from 30% of your intelligence, which is really just skill damage. For any main stat for your class, you can just divide the main stat by put it down to 10% of what it is. That 10% is the percent skill damage that it will scale up. So if you have 100 intelligence, that's 10% more skill damage, and the minions will get 30% of that, which it makes it a decent stat to scale up. It's not as strong as some of the others, but it does give you a way that when your intelligence goes up, your minions will actually do 30% of that value more in damage output. I also tested all of the skill damages, which some of them, at least logically from an outside perspective, you would think that they would work. But no minions benefit from bone skill damage. This includes bone mages and bone golem. No minions benefit from blood skill damage. This includes the blood golem. No minions benefit from darkness skill damage, and this includes the shadow mages. So all minions, when they deal damage, as far as the skill category is concerned, are all considered summoning skills, and anything you do around bone skill, blood skill, darkness skill, or any other skill type for Necromancer will do nothing for your minions. They are under the category, the hierarchy of summoning skill. However, they do benefit from what seems like the full amount of your summoning skill damage. So when you're looking back on these pages and you see that most of the damage scaling that minions get is 30%, it seems like summoning skill damage is 100, which makes it one of the best stats for pure minion damage. You can get it on your chest, you can get it on your amulet. Anywhere you can get summoning skill damage, it's actually better than most other damage scalers for how much damage your minions do specifically. And lastly, minions gain 100% of your bonus vulnerable damage. I don't know why, they just do. So if you get 80% more vulnerable damage, if your minion's attacking a vulnerable target, they will do 80% plus the base amount more to that target. They get exactly the same amount that you do, which if you're looking for a minion build, it seems like the best way to do that for pure minion damage outside of uniques is summoning skill damage and vulnerable damage. I also tested a bunch of legendary aspects to see what affected the minions and what didn't. No minions benefit from the Serration aspect or the ossified essence key passive. This kind of makes sense. They're not actually skills. They're not spending essence. So you wouldn't think that the ossified effect, either through Serration or otherwise, would have any effect, and it doesn't. I also found that Ossuous Gale does not apply to the duration of your golem's Bone Storm, which I feel like it should, but it doesn't. Your golem's Bone Storm will have its base duration and fade away. Even if you have Ossuous Gale of any amount, it won't extend the duration of your golem's Bone Storm, just yours. Shadow Mages seem to apply Shadow Blight. Like, they will actually apply the Shadow Blight effect, but when they do shadow damage to a target that has Shadow Blight, they don't seem to stack the Blighted effect, which is kind of a weird contradiction. I'm not sure why they would have one or not and not the other, but that seems to be where things are working. Aspect of the Dam, where you have 2 curses on the target and increases your shadow damage. Shadow Mages don't get any of that. You get more shadow damage, but the Shadow Mages do not seem to see any of that shadow damage scaling, unfortunately. Blighted and Inner Calm seem to apply to all minion damage and at full value, which turned out to be like 2 of the best legendaries for minion damage in general, because you get the value and so do your minions. Reanimation, which is the skeletons, the longer they're alive, the more damage they deal, is probably the best minion damage legendary. It always, in every form of testing, it always gives full value as long as the skeleton is alive for the duration, and that stays in perpetuity. If the skeleton never dies, he still gets the full value of reanimation in all situations, and doesn't seem to be any diminishing returns or limited aspect on that. For reanimation, it gives you the full value always. However, for Frenzied Dead, this one was a bit of a bummer. Frenzied Dead is the one where when your skeletons hit a target repeatedly, they gain attack speed for 3 seconds that stacks up to a maximum. This, when you're just normally playing, feels fine because you don't realize that there's kind of a critical downside with this. And that is, it seems like that the stacking effect of Frenzied Dead does not continue on the same target. So what I did is I tested bosses and high HP targets where they were hitting over and over. They would get the first attack speed bonus from the first hit. The second would scale it up more. The third would scale it up more. And then once they reached the maximum and that buff fell off, they never got the buff back again. It never came back. They needed to attack a new target to get the attack speed bonus, which means that when your minions are using Frenzied Dead against a boss or a high HP target, they will shortly, in a matter of seconds, no longer have any attack speed bonus from this legendary. I don't know if this is a bug or if this is intended, but I think that's kind of a feels bad man. Also did a bunch of testing on Kalan's Edict, which is the minion-based key passive at the end of the tree for Necromancer. And honestly, I would say that this thing just needs to be reworked. It just doesn't provide enough, and the conditions are very weird for a game where there's going to be enemies everywhere. And so the way it works is it gives you minion attack speed if you haven't been damaged in the last 3 seconds. This scales more when you have a lot of minions. This is supposed to be the key passive you choose when you have minions, and I've seen people complain that minion builds don't even run this. They run like Shadow Blight or, overpower based attacks with Death Speaker, and it's because Kalan's is just so weird. So it's also strange that this is how it functions in a game where by default, without like a bone golem taunting, all enemies will prefer to attack the Necromancer rather than the minions. Your minions actually have a hard time pulling aggro. Every enemy in the game is programmed to focus fire you rather than the minions if they can. If you go across the whole screen and you leave your minions behind, sometimes the enemies will attack the minions, but for the most part, most of the enemies will prefer to attack you. And there are situations in my testing where I was running in circles with 12 minions or 11 minions, and there were tons of mobs that were just chasing me, ignoring all of my minions. So if that's the case, and we only have one taunt for minions, this key passive just feels like it just doesn't have a home. But I did a bunch of testing to see if there was any way to improve it. And the results are not very promising. Being hit by an enemy while you have a barrier, so I was wondering, can you protect Kalan's Edict from falling off with various effects? If you have a barrier and you get hit and you lose barrier health, but your health is unchanged, still counts as a hit, you lose Kalan's Edict. Being hit by an enemy when you're fortified Didn't think this would work, wanted to test it anyway. It removes Kalan's Edict. Status effects, when they apply to you, count as a hit. They remove Kalan's Edict. Deployables, which are if there's no enemies around and there's just a puddle on the ground that applies status effect or applies damage, if you touch it, it removes Kalan's Edict. Blocking a hit from an enemy, which reduces the damage that you take, still removes Kalan's Edict. The only way that I have found in my testing to protect Kalan's Edict from falling off is if you dodge an attack. And if you dodge an attack, it doesn't remove it. It actually doesn't count as a hit. There's no instances of hit. If you dodge an attack, you will protect it. So if you're really kind of key set on running Kalan's Edict and you want to do it, there's a legendary that gives you dodge chance. You can roll dodge chance on your defensive gear and your boots. And maybe with high dodge, you could protect Kalan's Edict a lot easier and gain the benefit of that attack speed. Now let's talk about the most promising aspect of the minion testing, the unique ring of Mendeln. This is a ring in the game that has a lucky hit chance on it that when you have 7 or more minions, when you trigger this lucky hit effect, your minions become empowered and their next attack does a flat amount of physical damage that's listed on the item based on the tier of the item and how good you rolled that stat. So this one makes its way into a lot of minion builds. I've used it in many minion builds for damage, and it doesn't work the way you think it does, but understanding how it works is very encouraging for maximizing this, and this will be the next minion build that I work on, is a build that maximizes the effect of this. But for the minion fans out there, I will also do a build that focuses on increasing the damage that the minions themselves deal. So how does Ring of Mendeln work, and why is it so promising? First of all, Mendeln's lucky hit effect cannot be triggered by any minions or minion effects, only by the player. I tested this for long periods of time where minions, even the ones that we know can trigger effects, like the Reaper Special Attack, the Defender Shield Slam, and Minion Thorns, none of these can trigger Mendeln. You are the only person that one that's wearing the ring is the only person, the only character that can trigger Mendeln's lucky hit effect. Mendeln's damage is triggered for all active minions of any type, which means the more minions you have, the more instances of Mendeln damage you have. So maximizing it could mean getting as many minions as you possibly can, and then triggering lucky hit as often as you can. Mendeln's damage is sourced from the player, not the minions, even though the minion is delivering it. This means that Mendeln's damage is not scaled by any minion damage effects. Reanimation, any of your Paragon board effects, minion damage scaling, anything that makes your minions do more damage, none of those apply to the effect of Mendeln. It, for all intents and purposes, is as if you jumped into the hand of your minion and were swinging. It's your damage, it's from your stats. It has nothing to do with the minions in any way. But this is actually a positive because it means that Mendeln's damage can critically strike and is based on your critical strike chance, and it's scaled by your critical strike damage. So you can actually build things like Grasping Veins or higher chance to crit and higher crit damage in order to scale Mendeln's damage. Mendeln's damage does also scale from 100% of the player's bonus vulnerable damage, physical damage, close and distant damage, the inner calm aspect, which scales your overall damage, and the blinded aspect, which scales your overall damage, and conditional damage effects like damage to injured, damage to slowed, damage to stun. All of those apply in full to Mendeln. And Mendeln's damage scaling from bonus, close, and distant damage is based on the positioning of the player and not affected by the proximity of the minion. This one was a little bit tough to track down, but I did a lot of tests where the minions were right in front of the target and I was across the room, or I was right in front of the target with the minions and I moved the minions around. And I can tell you that it is based on where you are standing when the Mendeln effect hits, has nothing to do with the minions or when the minions fired. It could be, as long as you're in melee range and a skeletal mage from across the room throws a Mendeln, if you're standing next to the target when it hits, it'll count as close damage because it is your damage. Which means, theoretically, you could run a lucky hit, crit damage, vulnerable damage, crit chance, damage scaling build for Mendeln with only minion survivability, and you can make Mendeln hit exceptionally hard. And lastly, to keep this video short, let's talk about everything I learned about bonus minion damage and minion attack speed. This was the weirdest one by far, and it was almost impossible to come to a conclusive result with minion damage and minion attack speed. This includes minion damage on your gear, minion attack speed on your gear, minion damage and minion attack speed from your Paragon board. I had tested this in so many different situations for extended periods of time, over thousands and thousands and thousands of hits from the minions, and it was different almost every time. But this is what I learned from the testing results. Minions seem to benefit from about 20 to 50% of your bonus minion damage statistic. So if your minion does 100 damage from normal with whatever base stats you have fixed, if you add 100% minion damage from Paragon and your gear to your character, they will do about 20 to 50% more than they were doing before. I don't know why. It seems weird to me that they wouldn't get the 100% value of minion damage. I don't know if there's some other calculation going on, because this doesn't seem to behave the way that I would expect it to. But you, like, however much bonus minion damage you're giving your minions, I don't know how that's being applied. Like, maybe it's applying only to the top end of their damage. Maybe it's extending the range so that RNG-wise, even over a lot of hits, it's not going to be exactly the percentage scaling. Maybe it only affects a portion of their damage, but their base damage can't change. I don't know what's going on. Something is weird about minion damage and minion attack speed. So that is something to think about. However, percent minion damage from skills and legendary aspects. So if you have a piece of gear like reanimation, a legendary aspect on your gear, or if you have a skill bonus in your skill tree, or it's like minion skill, summoning skill damage, all of those seem to apply full value. They don't seem to have any reduction effects to them. No reductions, nothing. It seems to work exactly as you'd expect. If you run reanimation on your skeletons and it says 45% or 30% more damage, they will always deal 45% on amulet or 30% in other places. That much more damage. There doesn't seem to be any weird things going on there. And lastly, when it comes to minion attack speed, I tested this for hours. I've got a speed run timer, like a speed run timer up in the corner, and I recorded a minion. I started the speed run timer, and I had a minion attack the same target for 5 minutes straight, with the timer rolling with the exact, like, down to millisecond values, tracking every single second that they're attacking. I counted the number of attacks in a 5-minute period, and then I would finish that test, and then I would put on like 50% more minion attack speed, and then run the exact same test again with the same minion. I even tried killing and respawning the minion after putting on the minion attack speed, just in case there was some snapshotting going on, which it didn't seem like there was. But in general, after all of those tests, when you equip a certain amount of minion attack speed, either through Paragon or on your gear pieces, it seems that about 15 to 30% of that value will be applied to the minions' attacks per second. I don't know if that means that they have some, like, they have a minimum attack speed and then like a smaller amount that's on top of that, and it's scaling the smaller amount. It doesn't seem to be taking into account your weapon speed or your bonus attack speed in any way. They just seem to be getting about 30% of minion attack speed in their attacks per second. So if they normally attack at like 1 attack per second, and you put on like 100% minion attack speed, they will be attacking 30% faster at the end of that. I don't know why. There's something going on there. Hopefully, maybe Blizzard can like explain something or tell us what's going on, or tell me at least why these results are from the testing. But no matter what I did, I couldn't get a conclusive, straightforward result from adding minion damage from your gear or your Paragon, or adding minion attack speed from your gear or your Paragon. And that's what I've got for minions. I will post for a separate video. So this one's already too long as it is. I'll post a separate video going over the tests and the exact results. So for anyone who's curious, who wants to get into the nitty gritty, I'll post that as a separate video, but this will be for the findings on how minions work. And I hope that at very least it helps you understand how to make better minion builds. I'm assuming that all of this scales and is applied to Sorceress minions, Druid minions, and Barbarian minions, but I won't know until I actually get there and test it. But hopefully this was helpful. It took a couple days of work, so if you found value in the video, leave a like down below, leave a comment so the algorithm picks it up and helps this video get seen by more people. And if you have any questions or comments, come by my live stream. I'd be happy to chat with you. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.